Blake, thank you for joining us today.
Of course, happy to be here. A wonderful day here at NDP convention. We're very excited.
Well, excited, but at the same time dealing with some very heavy issues first thing out of the gate on a Sunday morning, beginning with the Prairie Green landfill in Manitoba. Of course, the issue has gotten national attention. It played a big part in the Manitoba election. Why was it important for the party to address that nationally?
I think for Canadians right across the country, they're worried. They're worried that if they have a mother, a sister, or a missing person, that they're going to be found, or worse, they're not going to be found and they're going to be dead. And New Democrats know, because we've been talking with families right across the country, including Morgan Harris, a fantastic organizer in Winnipeg. It's her mother she's looking for, and it's so important that we actually do the work to find these women, to find these missing people. In Canada, we have a promise. That is, if you should go missing, if you should be murdered, that the law and the weight of our country will do whatever they can to make that human suffering, to eliminate that human suffering. And that means, if that means finding your loved one, that means making sure they have a dignified burial. If that means that we're ensuring Indigenous people right across the country hear our message, that if you go missing, we'll find you, it's important, not just for people in Manitoba, but right across the country, to know that when you go missing, New Democrats will force this government and do everything we can to find them.
How does that differentiate New Democrats from, say, Liberals? For example, the Prime Minister has committed hundreds of millions of dollars to look at the feasibility of the search of that landfill, and also, as you know, has stated that there's no more important relationship for him and for Canada than the relationship with Indigenous people. So how does that distinguish the two parties?
I think it's an incredible difference when we see consecutive Liberal and Conservative governments. We often hear them say how important Indigenous people are, whether it was Stephen Harper when he was the Prime Minister and he made a historic apology to residential school survivors, but did no action to ensure that he actually spoke to survivors, to actually ensure that he did actions related to the stories of residential schools. He even, at the beginning of his announcement, or later on after his announcement, would be litigated against survivors, and he would fight them in court. Justin Trudeau took on that fight and continued to fight survivors, particularly survivors of St. Anne Residential School. We're seeing huge continuous missteps by the current government, even though they've committed to these things. And so they're saying the right things. You know, New Democrats welcome the statements, we welcome the press releases, but it's about time that we start to welcome action. For example, when it comes to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Canadians were promised that we'd see serious action. While our survivors, our grandmothers, our residential school survivors are right now still with us, we're losing them day after day after day while this government sits on its hands. They've only implemented 13 of the 94 calls to action. It'll take our country till 2065 before we ever complete all of them. We're seeing a really dark time in Indigenous communities right now. We're seeing some of the largest pressures of the cost of living. We're seeing the largest pressures of social inequity, and we need a government. We truly need a government that means what they say, and New Democrats truly do.
Now, the other big policy front being discussed this morning, it's amongst the top four, are queer rights and trans rights. How much of that is a reaction to the parental rights debate that we're now seeing across the country?
I think any time in our country when we're seeing vulnerable communities being attacked, it's incumbent upon all of us to stand with them, especially those with power and especially those with a voice. I'm just one MP from Northern Alberta, from Edmonton, this small community of very good people, but we know that when one of our community members gets pushed down, we're there to pick them back up. And what we're seeing is Conservative premiers and even the leader of the official opposition lending their support to this far-right organizing and propping up hatred, allowing for the most vulnerable people, children, trans kids who are discovering who they are, who are exercising their constitutional charter rights to be protected, to be understood, and to be members and full members of our society. We're seeing a direct attack on their ability to enter our society in a good way.
But of course, the other side will argue, if you have a child under the age of 16, you have a right to be informed. Where do parental rights fit in? What do you say to parents who see this as an issue of being a good parent, not a bad parent?
I think when it comes to parental rights, that's where the Conservatives want to have the debate. They don't want to have to talk about trans rights, for example, where the Charter of Rights and Freedoms directly applies. It applies to all individuals. As a matter of fact, most people might not know, but the Charter of Rights and Freedoms applies across the globe. They're Canadians' commitments to human rights. And so when we frame the conversation as a matter of only parental rights, we ignore the fact that other people, including children, and most particularly children who deserve those constitutional protections, are entitled to. And so it's an unfortunate day when children are pit against parents and parents are pit against children, because it only seeks to divide those groups. Parents have an immense responsibility to raise their children in a loving, caring, and prosperous way where they get everything they need. We're seeing right now in Saskatchewan in particular, at least Scott Moe, has a province of one of the largest and highest child poverty rates in the country. You'd think if a premier is really concerned about parental rights or children's rights, he'd be directly speaking to the reality that they're suffering from the largest child poverty rate in recent decades for Saskatchewan. And this is a real thing happening. Children are going to be harmed by this. And so it's really important that we take into context the reality that children in Saskatchewan are facing, but also the reality trans kids are facing. But I want to be clear that never should Canadians have to pick and choose between whose rights are better than others. Parents have an immense responsibility. They have rights to protect. They have a right to ensure that their children and their families are raised in a good way, but that doesn't mean they're allowed to ignore the Constitution. That doesn't mean they're allowed to ignore the human rights that these children have.
Now, on that matter, we know that the Liberals have dedicated money for more security at Pride events all across the country this past summer, have spoken out in the protection of trans rights as well. So how do you see your party working alongside government on that issue?
Well, we really want to push them. There's an upcoming federal budget in the spring. We need to see historic investments in the 2S LGBTQII programming across the country at this time, more importantly than ever. In 2019, the federal government did a good thing, which was they ensured that there was going to be federal funding to support 2S LGBTQII organizations on the ground, grassroots organizations that youth, other persons of the community were able to come to and seek support for what they were facing. The government, as you might be aware, actually tried to end that funding. They said it was a one-time funding. These organizations should be afloat all by themselves, and we're still facing that incredible resource issue. There's an immense amount of organizations who are doing good work for community members that are right now underfunded. They're spending 90% of their time trying to write grants, trying to just keep their organizations afloat when they could be organizing and saving lives by ensuring that their organizations serve queer communities. So we need to see this government move on ensuring that, one, there's a guarantee for funding in the upcoming budget for the 2S LGBTQII plus organizing and community building, but also to ensure that there's a commitment to build even more financial and social supports for the trans community in particular. We need to do this because our democracy is at stake. Who are Canadians? I said it in my speech earlier today. Democracy should mean, in Canada, we're all included, and we should have the courage to protect all those who are in our society who are included. And so I think that it's a matter of social democracy, it's a matter of democracy that we support those who right now feel excluded from our society.
Blake Desjarlais, thank you for the time.
Thank you so much.